for being targeted, focused, and on time. Dr. Magnus Ranstorp, Research Director of the Center for Asymmetric Threat Studies, Swedish National Defense College in Sweden. Dr. Magnus Ranstorp is currently based at the Swedish National Defense College, directing a large funded project on the strategic terrorist threats to Europe, which focuses on both radicalization and recruitment of Salafist jihadist terrorists across Europe, and the critical issue of convergence between CBRN and terrorism. Previously, he was the director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence, CSTBV, at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland. Dr. Ranstorp is the author of Hezbollah and Lebanon and other numerous articles and monographs on terrorism and counterterrorism. His most recent edited book is Mapping Terrorism Research, State of the Art, Gaps, and Future Direction. Dr. Ranstorp has briefed numerous government officials and is an elected fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences.
Thank you very much. It's only the second time it's been in relation to your remarks of the Jewish reference. Actually, the other time I've been referred to as a U.S. Jewish researcher was by Al-Manar TV in Lebanon, proclaiming victory even before the withdrawal. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Shalom, Naim Meod. It's great to be back here in Israel, in Herzliya, and let me express my delight to be here at the 8th ICT conference, which has grown into, as was mentioned yesterday, one of the largest and most important CT forums around. I think it's only appropriate from the outset to congratulate Boaz Genor and the ICT staff and team for their tremendous achievement in providing a crucial forum of exchanging ideas and for innovative thinking about how to confront this polymorphous threat that we are facing, which are continuously changing shape and direction. Now, it's difficult to always be after Rohan, given his forensic detail about what is the current operational threat. So I'm going to span it out a little bit in terms of providing some context as to the current threat picture and its perhaps more future direction. Today we live in exceedingly turbulent times with new complex security environment around the world alongside traditional threats that fundamentally challenges our security architecture. It also critically challenges our societal resilience and our ability to maintain the appropriate balance between security and the very values that our democracies are based on in this shadowy war against terrorism that parasitically thrives on the dark underside of globalization. In many ways, I'm reminded of the words of T.E. Lawrence that this new type of adversary appears to have ghost-like qualities in its capacity to simultaneously appear everywhere but nowhere, with no front or ends to grip at. My first argument today, and this is not directed at the Israeli audience or the ones within the region, but really to the West, to the Europeans, to the US, and I would have to say it's questionable whether enough intelligence analysts or senior policymakers adequately understand in conceptual terms the sheer complexity of these interconnected, intertwined challenges that lie ahead on the horizon. In this quest to develop instantaneous scorecards or metrics to understand whether Al-Qaeda is on the march or in terminal decline, we are often blindsided of the culturally different cognitive architecture, we in the West, that underpin the very nature of the perception of our adversary. It's not only in relation to different concepts of time and space, but also in relation to perception of how war is made and how winning is really understood. And please forgive me my indulgence to use a familiar analogy in terms of games, but I have to say that perhaps the best illustration of this cultural paradigm I'm talking about in our part of the world is provided by the game of chess. Static, linear, unidimensional. And this paradigm should in contrast be contrasted with that of the Oriental game of Go. And for those of you who don't play Go, in Go, there are no fronts. Offense and defense are often blurred. Fortifications and massing simply provides targets for implosive attacks. Victory is achieved not by checkmate, as there is no king to decapitate, but by gaining control of a greater amount of the battle space. This analogy succinctly embodies critical differences in societal and tactical and strategic thinking across cultures. Time is on their side in their mission. The fact is that they understand us much better than we understand them. They have us fixed. And the fact that we are in constant self-denial, that we don't understand or need to understand the other on so many different fronts, puts those in the front lines at a huge disadvantage. It also complicates our battle for the so-called war of ideas if we don't understand what matters and influences in those cultures in a globalization environment, and it provides the elements for further strategic surprises when and where we least expect it. Now, let me move less from the theoretical to the more practical. What are the drivers that are driving this current environment? What will continue to shape this asymmetric new environment? Well, the first factor is the idea of whether we're in the midst of what I heard someone in the intelligence community thinking strategically about this issue, whether we are in a second enlightenment, when we have technological epochal leaps and its impact and effect on societal change. I'm not sure if we really have mastered the effects of this for the future. The second factor is the crucial importance of the disorderly spaces, weak or no governance. And here we have zones of social and economic exclusion with mega urban cities that are important incubators of crime, terrorism, and disease. Now, I may state the obvious, but we are living through an unprecedented period of urbanization. Climate change, reductions in arable land, exploding birth rates in the developing world are combining to create mega cities on a scale that is unimaginable just 30 years ago. And I would say there are large geopolitical drivers like environmental degradation will have an effect on terrorism in the future. In fact, I would predict to see the increased mobilization and militancy of environmental activism in the future as reality sets in and as citizens realize states are impotent or unwilling to reverse these global trends. The third factor is the effects and multiplicity of globalization flows. Now, we see these flows with the internet or cyberspace constituting a central nervous system for Al-Qaeda in terms of its viability of structure and even as a movement. And here we see Salafist global jihadi contributors from around the globe participate in what I call a global brainstorming exercise, how to achieve and wage terror, whatever context or the enemy. Fourth factor is the agility and flexibility and difficulty in countering these complex adaptive learning networks. And here we not just facing terrorist organizations and networks, but also criminal organizations, proliferation networks, and their capacity to coordinate, learn, adapt, and enjoy high levels of flexibility, and a strong capacity for regeneration. But perhaps the last sort of issue is the sheer contextual complexity of the new security environment. There are no independent or dependent variables. Rather, everything within the complex system is interdependent. And if we had Chris Donnelly, many of you who know him, advisor to 4 NATO Secretary Generals in succession, Western societies are now at war and in revolution, though we have and operate with a peacetime mentality. According to Donnelly, the definition of this war and revolution is the speed of change, both in terms of technology and its effect on society. Predicting the speed of change and the multi-layered conflation of the global and the local through the effects of globalization is truly a complex and even wicked problem. Now, each of these factors brought about by globalization has opened up a Pandora's box of challenges. How does this complex new security environment translate into the terrorism sphere? Well, the changing contours of these asymmetric entities means that the intelligence challenge is different and requires new methods of collection and analysis. In intelligence, it has led to a paradigm shift from need to know to need to share, and we see that all around in terms of the partnerships that have been forged since 9/11. It has dramatically shifted the intelligence architecture away from stovepipes between agencies into so-called terrorism intelligence fusion centers. Many states still have a long way to go to bridge their own stovepipes and rivalry between agencies. Globalization has also meant diffusion of knowledge for understanding the threat and for the adversary. And I'm reminded of the comments made by the former head of JTAC, the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center, who described his work, or part of his work, apart from the secret bits that they are engaged in. When asked, what is the challenge in your work? And he said simply, our work can best be characterized as trying to drink water from a water hydrant on full blast. It is a veritable tsunami. It's not an absence of information. It is about how we collate it, analyze it, share it, and this is a critical yet complex undertaking. Now, onto the ability to counter this issue. Our fire extinguishing capability has largely been working, as evidenced from the scores of terrorist plots and cells unraveled across Europe over the last few years. Yet we have only begun, as Rohan illustrated, on the issue of the ideological confrontation. And here we require knitting together on the global, regional, local level. And I think one area we haven't focused in on at all is public-private partnerships, leveraging that to a greater effect in innovatively reaching with policies that are socially, culturally, politically relevant to a very young population that we are seeing around the world. We are clearly collectively facing a complex constellation of evolving, sophisticated asymmetric adversaries. And as of course shown by the plots just this year in Frankfurt, Barcelona, Copenhagen, where I live, over the last year alone, and the escalation of the threat by Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and the threat that poses to Europe, the threat level and the intensity of the desire to perpetrate mass casualty attacks within Europe is certainly not diminishing. Rather, the complexity of the security environment is increasing with the advance of the internet, new technologies, the global influencing the local, with a range of adversaries, whether you're talking about Europe or in most other countries or regions, that are better organized, more clever, more connected with conflict zones than we previously thought. If we look at the global threat picture, perhaps the epicenter of the threat posed by Al-Qaeda begins in the Fatah areas of Pakistan, where AQ continues to have a strong profile. It is here some of the key training facilities are located, with the capacity to stretch across the globe as plots are hatched and European-born recruits are trained and deployed potentially for blowback operations. This is not just confined to a UK problem, where the Pakistani dimension has made itself felt in almost every single CT investigation. I happen personally to live 200 meters away from the latest Glassway case in Copenhagen, an apartment occupied by two terrorists who manufactured TATP and had contact with Abu Nashir al-Qahtani, the chief al-Qaeda officer in Afghanistan, and who are trained in Fatah, making themselves ready for fighting on behalf of the Taliban, but also, of course, in 2006, making themselves available to fight for Hezbollah, if that was necessary. The Fatah region is also critical, as Rohan mentioned, as a sanctuary from the propaganda that can be skillfully packaged through Al-Sahab and deployed to mobilize support and relevance across a range of issues, masterfully woven together in the so-called single narrative, which has wide resonance across militants and contexts. I think, as Nigel Inkster, the former head MI6, has described the current situation, there is a perfect jihadi storm brewing up in the tribal areas of the Fatah region. No one but Richard Barrett can more authoritatively speak on the issue as the head of the UNAQ Taliban Sanctions Committee in this recent assessment issued by Peter Neumann's Radicalization Center. And I would urge everyone to read it because it is quite an insight. And here he argues that troops are good. We need more troops perhaps in Afghanistan, but it's not going to solve the issue. We must exploit the rivalries between and potential risks driving a wedge between the Pakistani Taliban and AQ forces using a series of conciliatory measures involving more carrots and sticks. Now, above and beyond the complexity of the Pakistani situation, I think it's worthwhile echoing again Nigel Inkster, who brought up or flagged the situation in India as a potentially troublesome terrorism area. It has suffered quite a large terrorism challenge inspired from largely Kashmiri elements and nebulous connections to Pakistani structures. But there is seemingly a concern over a trend of indigenization of the threat, which should be of concern as India is the second most populous nation of Muslims after Indonesia with 250 million adherents, especially if this threat materializes with a large potential for sparking intercommunal violence. Equally, the situation in the Maghreb warrants concern as the AQ has expanded its strategic partnership, most notably with AQIM, with serious repercussions for the escalation of violence, not just against France, but also in the surrounding areas in Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, and of course the Pan-Sahel region that is often highlighted. Let me turn the attention to the Horn of Africa. And this region is particularly concerned from the Scandinavian context, perhaps in the Northern European context, to be a troublesome hot conflict zones, which the International Crisis Group has warned may become internationalized. While the diaspora communities in Sweden, the UK, and other EU states continue to provide material support for the conflict, Shabab militants have overtly threatened the prospect of formally joining forces with Al-Qaeda. Now, the silver lining in terms of this threat is that Al-Qaeda face some resistance from Somali clans who are less interested in radical anti-Western attacks and frown upon Al-Qaeda's signature large-scale attacks when they result in civilian casualties. And this is illustrative of a larger trend, I think, of setbacks that Al-Qaeda has suffered as senior leaders have seemingly spent more time defending the legitimacy of attacks in terms of targeting or having innocent civilian casualties. Adjacent to Somalia, I would flag Yemen, a weak and tribal state with economic fortunes with declining oil revenues, increased militancy, provides the ideal incubator for further extremism and potential jihadist base of operations. Now, it's not all in gloom and doom in the Middle East. It's clear Iraq, there have been successes. I'm not going to go into that. Fewer foreign fighters are arriving across borders and many defections have occurred. Some of these elements resurfaced within Lebanon, where they failed to ignite Salafist elements to destabilize Lebanon into sectarian warfare. And similarly, the situation looked bleak in Saudi Arabia in 2003 and 4, but the Saudis have reversed the situation successfully with detentions and interesting de-radicalization programs within prison. And of course in Europe, Europe is becoming an important battleground with violent extremism is playing out to varying degrees depending on the context. The UK is, in the words of Peter Clark, on a voyage of discovery. You mentioned that quite recently. I think it's quite a nice way of phrasing it in terms of understanding what is the breadth and depth of the problem, the homegrown violent radicalization challenge, which is often accompanied by foreign tentacles lurking in the background. In fact, most of the investigations have had Pakistani links, but it's not just in the UK that have that problem. I mentioned Denmark, but we also have other cases. It shows to illustrate for Europe, radicalization leading to terrorism is posing a strategic threat to many countries as they struggle with integration and segregation problems and extremism as well as polarization within societies. On this level, and we worked a lot on this issue, in Europe, looking at not just what is happening on the radicalization front, but what are the effects of some of the measures that are being applied. Let me say really two things in terms of radicalization. I know there's a panel later on that is on this issue. The first is, I would caution, first of all, I would say there's a great degree of diversity of Muslim communities across Europe. There are some of which are greater risk to be influenced by radicalization forces. The fact is we do not adequately have enough data on the dynamics of forces at work within these different Muslim communities, and we need to do more work on that issue. Let me urge in that level, which I've discovered working in our own backyard in Scandinavia, that city planners probably have the most highly granulated picture of what is going on within specific neighborhoods and within specific communities. The last issue, and I see the clock is flashing here red, is the issue of what I would call the metaphorical wars. And I think they are going to be very critical. The metaphorical wars meaning the Muhammad cartoon crisis, the Wilders crisis. They severely test EU crisis management machinery, but they also have the propensity to unleash huge forces that are very difficult to control in relation to polarization, in relation to how do you manage these issues. I can say from a Danish and Scandinavian perspective, the recent attacks in Pakistan against the embassy was part of a decision by Ayman Zawahiri to exploit these types of metaphorical wars that I think we have to spend more time on in terms of thinking through the effects, but more importantly, how we manage them more proactively, because that in the end will play into how we manage the Al-Qaeda or how we confront this ideological struggle in managing down, in trying to prevent the next generation from buying into this whole sort of issue. Finally, hopefully given you some scope of thought in terms of the scale, scope, and complexity of the challenges we are facing. They are quite unprecedented. And in this context, let me finally, I've learned from Peter Neumann to say it twice to give the audience a sense of hope. Let me conclude by quoting Sun Tzu's dictum that if you know your enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the battles ahead. In the current security climate, one can argue whether we know ourselves enough, let alone our enemies, to address the security challenges we have to face for the future. And again, let me extend my gratitude to ICT for its foresight and willingness to take on these challenges in the face of global complexity. It has been 7 years ago since 9/11. It's often easy to forget the suffering and impact of terrorism on communities and nations, but it is important that we do not forget the focus on our common challenge. Thank you, ICT, for keeping these issues in focus and for assembling a very interesting next couple of days to take on, to find solutions to some of the problems I've outlined. Thank you for your kind attention.